All right, so we're live, and I'll just hit record here. Okay. All right, and just we'll make you host now. You could, can you make me co-host right after that?
Sure. Of course.
Thank you. Oh, there's Daniela. You'll Daniela co-host.
Yep.
You may just check. Do you want the chat function on? Sure. Okay, so that's.
I mean, I'm anticipating there's maybe going to be 6 people at this meeting, so people tend to be extremely well behaved at this one.
So right now, everyone can unmute themselves, start their video, and rename themselves.
If I need to change something, I think I can probably figure it out, or I'll just shut the whole thing down and I'll text you or something.
Oh, the SCA meeting I thought was helpful.
For sure. There was some clarifications that even I really appreciated having.
Fair.
That's our speaker. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll get started in a minute or two. Hello, Iris. Nice to
Hi,
meet you.
how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for
Good.
joining us.
And you've met Abby Hughes, who's the Bridging the Gap social worker at PS 51?
Abby, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Of course. I'm happy to be here.
Right. 7:31. We've got a good couple people here. I'm thrilled to see you all. Welcome to 2022 and our first meeting of the year. This is the CECD2 Students in Temporary Housing Committee. Welcome, welcome to all, to anybody who might be watching this after the live meeting. We have a wonderful group of people who are very dedicated to helping District 2's kids across the spectrum. But tonight we're going to be focusing on our students in temporary housing. So I thought we could start with just a couple of quick updates and then move into asking Iris to give us a short update on where things stand, and then giving Abby the floor to make some comments, and then we can open it up to questions because I know we have a lot for you. From my end, there's a couple of updates. 3 of the schools in District 2 have been really terrific partners at putting together wish lists for their own school communities. And the winter timeframe that we were working with ended up getting a little bit complicated. And so I think our major outreach and push is going to come in the coming weeks for circulating these lists amongst other school communities, and also with some other groups that have raised their hand that would also like to help and contribute. So I will be doing what I can to work with people like Robin Kelleher, who has been one of the school liaisons working with one of our schools that has the largest population, Chen Kwok and his school, and Robin Broshi in the school for which he is also liaison. I just want to be careful about not outing too many of the schools that they're representing, but each of those 3 schools has been really, really terrific and dedicated at serving their students. So yeah, we will do what I can to make sure that we keep reaching out to any other schools on that list, because there are more than 3 schools that have significant STH populations, and we'll keep going and do what we can, because there's such a generous D2 family community out there to see what we can do to help. So that project sort of stalled a little bit in December, but we will get it going over the course of the coming weeks. So with that, Iris, I'd love to ask you a couple of open-ended questions, and also welcome your comments really of really any sort on where things stand. But if you could just update us on the number of shelters that are open, those that have closed, those that might soon open, where any of our D2 students might have largely moved in the event that the place that they were living did close. And just the floor is yours to give us as much information as you can.
Thank you. We had 14 hotels in District 2, and very quietly, all those families were moved out of the hotels, and they were moved, for the most part, to the Bronx and to Brooklyn. The issue that we're having now is that the children, we want to keep the children in the schools. Our District 2 schools are wonderful. And the biggest problem that we're having is getting the children to school every day. This was very difficult on the kids. Most of them were moved out Christmas week, the last couple of weeks of December. School opens in January. Getting busing for these kids. Now, you are all aware of the issues with busing, right? I don't have to articulate that. Concomitant with that, the bus drivers are coming down with COVID. So even with existing routes, the routes aren't happening because there's nobody to drive the buses. And what we're finding is a lot of parents, and Abby can speak to this, a lot of parents are saying, I have to transfer, because nobody wants to make the hour and a half, 2-hour commute from wherever they are back to the school. And it's a real problem. We had 1,500 families. We now have 1 shelter left in District 2. That's Children's Rescue Fund. The hotels that we have, some are very close to the school, are now isolation rooms for adult men and adult women. With the onset of the the break on rent coming to the end this Friday. I would imagine DHS doesn't have capacity to manage more families. Maybe they'll reopen the hotels. I don't know. I'm very concerned about our population. These kids had an attachment to their staff. The parents may have multiple children. Commuting on a train with many children is very difficult. I tried to work with Melissa Ramos from DHS about where those families were going to see if I could arrange for busing over Christmas. All that I could find out is what borough they were moving to. They really moved out very quickly and very quietly. So for an example, in PS 33, which is on in Chelsea on 9th Avenue, they had about 35 STH kids. They now have 5 STH kids. Abby's school had at least 65 or 70 kids. I think that 30 have moved out, but you can, so I'm finding this all over the place and I don't know what's going to happen. I have been told that there is a shelter that's supposed to open on West 41st Street and 10th Avenue. There's a building that has a couple of tenants in there that they will keep and they were going to make it a family shelter. I've gotten no word on that. I thought it was a wind shelter and then a WECO shelter. So I'd love to get our kids back. I just feel like it's a ghost town for District 2.
Is this something that you're seeing? I know you covered District 3 as well.
Yes.
Which
So in
is
District 3,
the Upper West Side, right?
Yeah, the Upper West Side. They closed 2 shelters, and the shelters that they closed in District 3 needed to be closed. They were abysmal. They must have had so many violations. But there aren't a lot of shelters in District 3. The Frant is big, the Regent is big. West End Intergenerational has young mothers, 18 to 25 with babies. And then there's a DV shelter. And that's it for District 3. So Midtown, Chelsea, and the Upper West Side has been decimated.
Well, one other thing that I was hoping to ask you about, I went to a couple of the town halls that were organized by
Michael Hickey.
by Michael Hickey, related to how they're going to, hearing from the community about how to use the influx of money from the American Recovery Act. Do you know when any announcements will be made about the final determination on how that money will be used?
I know that they came up with a plan. They submitted it to the chancellor. They're waiting to hear, I imagine, within the month. And I do think that's about $10–12 million worth of things that they're planning on. They include things, he included things like having schools serve as pantries, but not just food, clothing, coats, underwear, hygiene stuff. I really like that idea. He had about 14 ideas. I don't know if they're going to be accepted by the chancellor.
So the DOE chancellor has adjudication rights over how that $10–12 million would be used?
I think that they want to review it. I don't know for a fact. Don't quote me on that. I do know it was submitted. Okay.
Okay. Appreciated. I know in the town hall session that I went to, the most popular was to increase the number of social workers that were being used, and there was a lot of discussion about enrichment activities, whether they be after school or tutoring kind of sessions. But some of that is going to be extremely dependent, in my mind, on what you just said related to where the students actually are, and the transportation issues that are wrapped up in them.
I'd like to address that. Our kids really need after school programs. It is so important. You don't want to have a child sitting in a shelter. School's the best place for the child to be. Here's the issue. They don't get busing from the after school home. And in fact, the way busing is working these days, children are being picked up much earlier than when school ends, just to get on the bus, because there are so many children on the bus and so there aren't that many buses. If we could use some of that money to pay for busing, I think that would be a wonderful idea, to keep them in after school and then to bus them home. It would also make it very inviting for families to remain in the school. You know, it's such a struggle. Abby, do you want to address the families that spoke to you about transferring?
Yeah, so I was just speaking with Stephanie Lucas, who's our principal today. I mean, we speak every day about this. It's like, I think, so we've been back from break since last year, and we've had 6 students, 6, I believe maybe 7 tomorrow, or 8 that have 9, sorry, every day the number is changing, that have transferred. But it's not like, you know, when they get permanent housing, that's a wonderful thing. We understand that, like, that is consistent. And so transferring to a school nearby is like, we understand that, because now they have the consistent home and building their community and now their own community. It's a lot of our families that got pushed out of Manhattan over the holidays into the Bronx, into Queens, not right on the border too, where it's like, you know, manageable, very far. Some of our families have like 2-hour commutes, and they want to, and like, we're in such like a hard place because they want to, we really pride ourselves on like really building a community with our families, like the teachers, the staff members, our students. And so, you know, we have like a lot, we just like offer a lot of like resources and support to our STH families. And so we build that community for them to want to stay. And like, we're in a hard place, kind of like what Iris is saying, with all the bus like staffing shortages and lack of bus routes. We're, even though we can say, hey, there's busing available through McKinney-Vento because they're in STH, like they're STH families, we can't guarantee. And then also, if we can route them, it takes 3 months. So we're like, we want you to come to school. You want to come to school. How do we best help you to like all work together? And then like the past week, we've had a few families where it's like, we want to be there. Like they love school. We love like having them there, but our commute is 2 hours long and we have 3 other kids. So it's like, that's where we've been right now. Just kind of like, we're all kind of like, it's kind of like heartbreaking because they want to be at our school. It's midway through the year. They have all these friendships. We have 3K to 5th grade. So we have a wide range. A lot of our families are like, all the siblings attend our school. So we're not just losing, you know, one kindergartner who can start fresh, you know, and develop all of their years in elementary school. We're having all these siblings that like some are leaving in 5th grade because we don't see busing for 3 months. And, you know, Iris is wonderful. Iris is my regional manager. So she has people that she knows, like, you know, throughout OPT, it's all about building our network, kind of like what all you guys have is like a good network. But everybody is like, how, like, cause it's all these systems trying to work together to best support our families. And we're all just like, darn it. Because at the end of the day, it's like another family transfer, just because it's like, we have to prioritize the children at the end of the day. And of course their families, and a 2-hour commute or to get to a school is just not ideal. So that's kind of where we're at. Like we have,
Sure.
I'll keep talking later.
I appreciate, we all appreciate your enthusiasm and your collective dedication. That was a topic about which at least I was an absolute broken record in the town hall that I went to, that enrichment and after school needs to be accompanied by funding related to transportation, that they are inextricably linked if we want to actually make a difference here. So, okay, thank you for that. Iris, I trust, please do keep us informed as you find out, because you'll probably find out sooner than the rest of us, if there are any specific announcements made related to how that 10 to 12 million will get allocated for STH.
I promise.
All right. So then with that, I would love to then open the floor to you, Abby. You're an excellent and animated speaker. So I think we, quite honestly, we want to learn from you. A lot of us are here because we're passionate, we want to help, but we want to be able to channel our efforts in the right ways. So if you can walk us through some of the issues that you're facing, or your families are facing, that you are facing, your families are facing, how we might be able to support you both with advocacy on policy issues, you know, on programming that we might be able to help, things that we can do across D2, across the city, et cetera, to help, and understanding that things are constantly shifting and changing. But really, the floor is yours to speak on any / all of those topics.
Awesome, thank you. I mean, kind of like what I just said, our biggest concern right now is the transportation, because, you know, before this close in our hotels in our zone, we we had like we had a lot of drives throughout the winter time with our like PTA, just so many different drives that we were able to provide to our families, whether it was food or hygiene products or clothing. We had like a whole closet that we've developed over the past like 3 to 4 years, like really solidified it. And it just is full of like everything. So we can provide to our STH families, which is awesome. And so I am sure, like, you know, we've had so much success from that, and it has been so wonderful from our community. So that has been great. And then, so we were doing, like, I feel like we were kind of at a high right before Christmas break, because like we were just like had all these connections with our families, and we were able to, like, everyone was able to get here. And then it kind of just got a little hectic right now after the holidays, because, you know, they don't tell us, kind of like Iris was saying, we were trying to figure out where they're going. They're all like all over the different boroughs. So right now it's kind of just trying to keep that community. And so I think, like, when you were talking about the policy issues, I don't know exactly what we can do when it comes to busing, besides just like advocating and just kind of making, you know, through all different avenues, just making our voices heard, that like, it is important, as you know, that STH kids aren't getting, you know, some of my students have like this, they're in 5th grade and they've been to 9 schools throughout their life thus far. So it's like, we're trying to keep that stability in these children's lives. And like, whether we're making the community or another District 2 schools making a like community with their student and developing that like trust and that rapport and that relationship with them, it's just trying to figure out how we can keep that stability and advocate for our STH families that they're just getting pushed around from shelter to shelter. So I think that's where we've all been brainstorming like every day. I mean, throw in like classes quarantining, that hasn't helped with some of our families, like, you know, being able to see them. And so I think every year we face a new obstacle. I don't want to say issue, because it's not always an issue, because it can be solved. But like right now, our obstacle is figuring out how we can use our resources in best helping them. So I don't know. I feel like right now I'm talking in a circle. So if you have any like questions that I'm not quite getting at, or
So
Iris,
there's
All right,
one
let
that
me jump in here for a moment. Abby's devastated over losing her students. You have no idea how hard this woman works with these children. There have been multiple ACS reports coming out on these children, because for the last 18 months, we haven't seen anything. Then children come back to school, and then the children end up in foster care. Abby works with these children individually. Then they go into foster care, and they're placed in the Bronx, or they're placed in Queens. You can't get a bus for them. It all comes back to the bus, because the only stability that these children have is the school. You see her passion. That's how she feels about her kids. That's how her kids feel about her. And I can duplicate that in the other District 2 schools. It's very special, District 2. There's a sense of community. There's a lot of love. It took a long time to get acceptance, and it's gotten much better. And we care about the kids. And now the kids are disappearing one by one by one. And all because of no busing. You want to advocate? Let's buy buses. Let's train people to drive the buses, and let's do it the right way. I don't fundamentally understand.
Yeah, I think one of the frustrations that I had, sorry, Robin and Danielle, I'll call on you next, that I first heard about was the fact that these 2 different groups are not communicating. There's no infrastructure about where a kid is, where they live, what school they go to, and how to best serve them towards, if a shelter does have to close, where to move them so that they're with other kids that are coming to the same geographic area. There's no electronic infrastructure whatsoever for knowing where any of these kids are. It's kind of 101, an essential that's just missing, but that's my
and there's also
frustration.
like, we can do what we can on our end. Like, I work so closely with our community coordinator. She is awesome, Chelsea Higgins. She puts busing in like right away, and the shelter puts busing in. So there's a communication there. It's just, we then wait months for a route to become available. And then it's just like, you know, these kids, whether they can get here, they can't. So that's kind of like, that's the main issue, because when they lived, if they got transferred to like a tier 2 shelter outside of District 2, the bus routes, it would take a while, but now we have everybody now out of District 2. And now I spoke to a Bridging the Gap social worker in District 9 today. She told me that just one of her shelters has 30 students from that shelter directly. And now they got so many more that are enrolling tomorrow and the next day, which means all of the students are now going to these schools. They're over, it's just kind of like if the Bridging the Gap social worker over there is overwhelmed, it's just because of busing, ultimately because of busing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Daniela, I see you have your hand raised. Go for it.
Yes, thank you so much for all your work and your passion for being here to help educate us so we can advocate better. So I have a couple of questions. So one is you mentioned that, they keep changing the families from shelter to shelter. Is that a common practice?
Yes,
yes, okay.
Yes. Now, it doesn't happen routinely. There's usually a reason. You come into shelter, you're found ineligible, you go back to the path, you get another 10 days. 8 times out of 10, you stay in the shelter that you came from. Sometimes you get transferred. Sometimes a parent has a fight with another parent, you get transferred. What I don't fundamentally understand, in fact, I just wrote the AP at DHS an email begging him. I've got a mother that works nights, the 12 to 8 shift. She has 2 children. One is developmentally disabled, okay? They placed her in a District 2 shelter, my only shelter in District 2. The children go to school in Queens. She works in Queens. She can't get her kids to school on time. Wouldn't the smart thing be find her a shelter by the school?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a parent that's clearly motivated if she's working to get out of shelter. Let's help the parent. And although DHS says that we try to do that, it would be very helpful if you could advocate for keeping children close to their schools.
Okay. And I'm trying to, there's so many problems and I know we need to address everything, but I'm trying to be like practical, strategic. And so what are the things that we can advocate within the DOE? Because I think we have a little bit more influence in the DOE than at DHS. And so what are the policies? And Ushma and I, we talked about this last time, Iris, that you were here, that I think the committee under Ushma's leadership have done so much in terms of like the basic necessities that families have right now, but like, what are the policies of the DOE that could be more helpful to you and that we should be advocating for?
I like the money spent in a way that provides direct service to children.
Okay, what exactly besides, but
after school programs, staffing for after school, getting them to the after school and getting them home from the after school. Okay, here's something that I feel very frustrated about. All the schools got a lot of money in Title I funds. You all know what Title I funds are? Mm-hmm. Okay. And they have to come up with a spending plan for the Title I funds. And they want to take care of the STH kids, but it is very difficult to purchase the goods that are needed because you're only allowed to purchase items on Shop DOE. And if you can't find your item on Shop DOE, then you have to go and get bids. And it is such an arduous process to do this. It's very difficult. Principals used to have P cards where you could make a purchase of up to $250 at a shot. So you could go buy that winter coat, or you could go buy that pair of boots, or you could go buy a pair of eyeglasses. But they don't have P cards anymore because of audits, because they're nervous for whatever reason. The same thing goes for SIPs, which is when a staff member lays out money for an item, pays for the item, puts in what they call a SIP, and gets reimbursed. But they look at all of these purchases and they can be denied. So although the schools have a better understanding of what those concrete needs are, maybe they've even done a needs assessment and asked them directly, purchasing is a problem. Mm-hmm. There should be more vendors contracted vendors, so we don't have to use 3 bids to be able to buy the items we need. Here are items we need for the high schools, the kids who managed to get into college, and maybe they're going away, maybe they've gotten a scholarship, getting stuff for their dorm. Try to find that in a vendor. The clothing for children, if you look at some of the vendors' clothing, I wouldn't put it on my kid. And if I wouldn't put it on my kid, I don't want to put it on an STH kid. So, you know, better like a nice coat, like a warm coat, not one of those thin wool coats. It would just be so much easier if they looked at their vendors and they got vendors that carried the goods that we needed.
If I can just echo this, you know, last year the CEC was able to spend $17,000 towards supplies and items for STH. Shino and I took charge of that. We had to buy everything through DOE vendors. We had to ship them to a DOE address, and we had to do it in $500 increments.
Correct.
Because that was as much as we could spend at any given time. It was infuriating,
Yes.
You know, like trying to help and having to jump through the very specific hoops
Right.
was infuriating. And the limitations on the sorts of things that you can do. So Robin Kelleher and I had a conversation a couple of weeks back about like, well, she had all these great ideas. I'm like, we can't do that. We can't do that. We can't do that. We can't do it that way because there are such specific walls that get put up. So I think one of the things, but I mean, I don't know whether or not the CEC advocating for this in a resolution is really going to do anything, like a resolution on the DOE increasing the number of vendors that they have. I mean, that's, you know, the sort of thing where we can work perhaps in conversation with some of our local electeds as a better way of going forward in these regards, you know, towards trying to change some rules.
Maybe
But,
they can expedite.
Even inside DOE, I think we can try to have a conversation. And quickly, one last question, and then I'll pass to Robin. When the families are moved, I'm trying to understand like what is the complexity of the, because I know transportation is very complex, and you know, especially this year, it's even harder. But for example, if there are families that if you wanted to offer transportation after school in one school, are all the students in that school now being transferred to the same shelter? How does that work? Because yes, I mean, I'm trying to understand if it is even feasible to have a transportation solution here to then be able to offer after school programs.
Okay. So depending on how many children you have, if you're a big family with 7 children or you're a small family with 2 children, depends on what shelter you'll go to. New shelters have opened up. They've taken hordes of people and put them in. Abby was talking about this one shelter that got a whole bunch of families, but there is no rhyme or reason except for size, how big the family is, because if you've ever been in a shelter room, there are rooms that are probably the size of your bathroom with 2 bunk beds, 2 sets of bunk beds, and a little refrigerator and a cooktop. And that's where you live with a bathroom. So that's for a family of 2, a mother and a child, that's suitable. If you're a bigger family, you've got to go with a tier 2 shelter that's going to have a lot more space than that. So it all depends on the size of the family.
Robin, you've been waiting patiently.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for the presentation. Obviously, we are all here to help, and I won't spend too much time thanking you, but thank you very much. Question about the busing, since you did bring that up as something that's very immediate need. Can you go smart? Do you know, I can't imagine living in a shelter because I have 3 kids doing stuff online already and it's crazy. Do you know, it'd be helpful to find out if it has to be a DOE school bus, no PT school bus, or if it could be a private bus, because that is something that, for instance, D2, if, for instance, we had enough support from different schools, separate from the CEC, but as parent reps at different schools, if we wanted to start, for instance, like a fund, like a busing fund, for instance, to help bus kids around, that specifically itemized as a school bus or a bus route for, STH kids, to either get them to school or get them home after school based on clusters. I mean, is it something that we could potentially, because it almost seems easier than raising money for clothes, since you have to deal with vendors. And if we were to find out like the quote unquote vendor information for the bus, if we could tackle the busing and find out a way. I mean, so I have two children at 33. I'm very involved with 33. It's heartbreaking for me to hear. I think you said there were 35. Now we have 5. I mean, that affects the whole school because we're a very tight knit school, and it's really that's awful. So I imagine even though 33 would be in less of a position probably to fund this busing route, there would be funds coming in from 33. There are other schools with higher funding that might be interested in getting involved. So if it were possible to find out how the busing would work, if we were potentially to tackle that kind of project, could we do that? Could that be an idea?
I want to respond to that. I have been told by OPT that a route, one
Mhm.
bus route,
Yep.
is $75,000.
And that's does that include morning and afternoon, or is
Yes.
that? And
Yes.
that's for everyone on that route. So that's what, like 40 children, for instance, 35 to 40 kids.
Yes.
I mean, that's a lot. Obviously, that's a lot. But if
But
we're
we
talking
have a
about,
lot of money. We have
yes, we have a lot of
all this
money. And money for things like this can be raised from families in District 2.
Why doesn't the DOE buy their own buses? Well, then we'll
That's a question I can't answer, but I can say that we could look into raising money and putting in bus routes. What if we added like 2 or 3 more bus routes to the main shelters?
I think it's a lovely idea. We have the money to do it without you raising it. Why aren't we putting the money there?
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Just because this is very naive.
Yeah.
The shelters that are in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens, are they more stable, meaning that they are staying open without the chance of them closing?
Yes. The only reason why the shelters in Manhattan closed was because de Blasio's legacy was to get families out of hotels. So he was very hell-bent on having all the families living in the Manhattan hotels moved. And that's why that happened. And ironically, it ended up having single men and single women now, the Stewarts, all of the hotels now. And they're using them also for isolation rooms because of COVID.
And is it extraordinary then to have a bus route to one of the main shelters going from District 2 to one of the main shelters and back?
There aren't main shelters.
You see there how many? There's several Tier 2. How many shelters are we speaking about?
I think there are about, correct me if I'm wrong, like 265 shelters. Although we just closed 14, so my number is off. But they're all over the place. They can be on the border of the Bronx and Yonkers. There are shelters where you have to take a bus to get to a train. Abby's been working with this kid, and the family really wanted to stay there. She did so much work.
I looked at my map, and it was like, and I'm come from Connecticut. I commute from Connecticut. And I was like, this is longer than my commute. It was 2 hours by walking to the train, by then taking a bus from the train to another train. And I was like, so that was when, and they didn't end up moving there because again, this DHS was like, never mind, new shelter. So they moved them somewhere else, and
they moved them somewhere else.
This was prior. This was prior. This was over break. They kept telling them, this is where you're moving, this is where you're moving. And then they said, plot twist, you're moving here. Still not great. Still 7 miles away. So I wanted to follow up on what Iris said really fast, because I think that it's important. Although that they're moving to the Tier 2 shelters, which aren't necessarily closing and they're not moving away, it's still now like kind of like what I said when I spoke with that social worker at the school in the Bronx. They're now flooding into these schools that I'm not in any way talking down to any other schools in other districts. But the resources that we have in District 2 we have a lot of resources. So, you know, they're going to schools that are flooded with STH kids. Do they have as many resources in that community?
No.
Not necessarily. So like, that's the thing is we're not trying to push out our kids. We're trying to pull them back in, like keep them here. But it's like, we're like, what do we do? So I think that is important, is like, of course they might be in that shelter for a little bit longer than they would if they were in the hotel. Maybe if, you know, depending on their circumstances and like all of that, but the schools up there. And that's why we have students that have moved to permanent housing like 2 years ago during the pandemic. We're still in the pandemic, but, and they still won't transfer despite them being so far because of the lack of resources and community. So just wanted to.
All right, thank you for that. I asked in the chat if Principal Lucas wouldn't mind also weighing in here from her perspective. And then I see one more hand raised, but Principal Lucas, if you wouldn't mind.
Sorry. Hi. I feel super passionately and strongly about our students, and like they are our students and have always been. There were two really large shelters that were just a couple of blocks from the school, and the kids are very much part of our community. And this past 2 weeks, having kids just not come back from break, but wanting to come back, I mean, we're very frustrated. And once we found out that this was happening, I mean, Abby, Chelsea, and Iris and I worked in a way that was, you know, not appreciated probably, but saying, okay, fine, you're closing the shelter, that happens, but there should be busing set up the day after they move to the new shelter. Like, we're changing so much in these kids' lives. We can keep one thing consistent for them. Let us be that thing. And I just felt like, why wouldn't that happen? You know the address they're going to, just create that stop. Like, it feels like, I mean, I know there's like logistical nightmares out there, but everything's a logistical nightmare. If Amazon can figure it out, why can't the DOE figure it out and keep our kids? Anybody who's choosing to stay, if they can get a package from that shelter to my building, I want the kid to come from that shelter to my building and get to keep going to school with their classmates every day. It's been very frustrating. And it's like, we didn't know even who to ask anymore, because if we start to sound like a broken record, just saying, please figure this out, get the busing set up. You know, you're closing the shelter. You make that announcement in November. So then in December, it should be in place. Let's get it going. And that's just, it's been very sad and hard. And we're just calling all of our families who, I mean, there's families who are taking the subway for hours with infants. Like right now, I don't know that you want to take your unvaccinated, unmasked wearing infant on a bus or on a subway, and people are doing it because they're trying to get their kids to school. And it just feels very not community based.
So Principal Lucas, with regard to that and kind of pegging off of something that Robin was saying, and I got a private chat, Uber, Lyft, things like that, community funded, like I know that the DOE would never end up paying for it because the drivers wouldn't be background checked and things like that. But in the instance of what you're talking about, you've got, you know, a parent that has an infant plus a kindergartner and they want to bring them. Is that the kind of thing that from a logistical standpoint, like the community could end up paying for, like private transportation, if they're going to choose to do it on their own?
Principal Lucas, let me answer this. Okay. They have that in place right now. It's called Limoges, or Abby, you know the name of it? The car service?
Limosies, yeah.
Okay, and the criteria for applying for this, we can arrange for car service from the shelter to the school. But follow me on this. You have to be found eligible by OPT. Now, I'm going to get very concrete. Family moves to a new shelter. Family has to be bused. You would hope that the case manager in the shelter would change on the transportation page in CARES from an M for MetroCard to a B for busing. Then it hits papers at the DOE. They have a list of children between DHS and the DOE, and they begin to look at routing these kids. If you don't have your name spelled correctly, if you're hyphenated, if you changed your name, gave the DOE one name and gave DHS another name, you don't show up on the ridership. And even if all your information is correct, you don't always show up on the ridership. let's say you get to, so in order to qualify for that, you have to show up on the ridership about to be routed to qualify for car service. Now, there are a limited number of car services available. They're getting very maxed out now. Now we're talking about 1,500 families. Maybe we're talking about, I don't know, 500, 600 children. I don't know if they could manage that because I know they're at capacity. It's something to look into.
Motoko, you've had your hand raised?
Yeah, thank you so much for this. So I'm just wondering, so if we were to try to arrange the bus though, you were saying that the time of the bus should be after school program time, and do the DOE's bus, the OPT bus, do they run that late?
No, they don't, but they could. Why can't they? I mean, people could pick up extra shifts. If we're
Yeah.
talking about picking up children at 6 o'clock at night when programs are over, all children leave school at 2:30. Routes have to be done by 4:30. Maybe people want to make more money. I don't see why it's a problem. I don't see why we don't continue to use those buses.
It might actually be cheaper, no? I'm thinking that if you give the money to the PTAs and the PTAs just do through Uber, it might be cheaper than the $75,000 that it costs a bus. I'm serious, like you can just give the money to the PTA and then.
Lupe?
Some of the points actually were made. I was going to bring up students with disability. We had this issue during the summer, and as well as students in temporary housing where they were not getting bused to their summer rising, and they did provide the car service reimbursements for that. But again, these are students that were already on the ridership, were listed, registered as a family that have had to use OPT. It's a broken system, and it's been a broken system for a really long time. Advocacy on, I think, OPT being audited and contracts being renegotiated as far as extending hours, I think is extremely valuable. And I think it would be a lot of work, but well worth it. Something that's been needed for, I think, decades. So I think that's something to think about because, and I don't know if we take this to a PEP level, but I just think that it's an atrocity what OPT has been getting away with for decades. And but as far as reimbursement for car services, and I know that they did offer that through the Summer Rising program. We had to use a lot of kids to get through that. Is it possible to tap into something that was an like emergency? It wasn't, I don't think it was through the Lou car service that you're talking about. Families were able to use whatever car service and we were able to get reimbursement for those families. Is that something that we can maybe advocate for in just this emergency case? Nothing obviously temporary, but.
Here's the problem with that. It's a wonderful idea. Our families don't have the money to pay for the car service to get to school and to get home.
But if the community funding that they were discussing earlier, as far as PTAs are concerned, to kind of front that up front. One logistical issue that's come up when this has been brought up in the past is like, who is then responsible for calling the car and following up? Like most of our families have cell phones that work pretty regularly, but not all. Right. And then there was a question of like, well, it should be the caseworker at the shelter who calls in the morning, or it should be the community court. Like there's this like piece that wasn't getting straightened out of like who would be the person calling, and then in the afternoon. And the other question around it is then if it's to transport a child to school, are you putting a 6-year-old in a car without the parent? And then who is paying for the reverse trip for the parent? If the parent is going with the child to school, then how does that parent get back? And so those were the pieces that were like not getting figured out in an earlier iteration of this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One other thing I was hoping you all could address is attendance of late within this population.
I'm going to jump in on this one because this is my major pet peeve or
Okay.
bone of, I don't know, everything. We are measured by our attendance in many, many, many ways, but we're also working against a system that does not help our children get to school. So right now we have kids who are being marked absent every day because they are waiting for busing to get sorted out. So my school's attendance is taking a hit that is ugly, but we want those families to know that we're advocating for them, and we want, if the busing can get worked out in the next few weeks, we want them to come. But that could mean a month if a parent's like, I'm not taking my kid on the subway, I'm not doing it, then that means they just don't come to school.
Which I feel like is then followed up with, if they're quarantined based on the devices with this year, because last year the DOE provided all the devices for remote learning, and I set them all up for the STH kids in our school, and we monitored them, and now they don't, and now the helpline, like you're on the phone for hours, they don't fix them like they were last year. There's like such a gray area for Spox to get the info, to figure out how to fix these iPads. So even if let's say they move to a shelter or they're still in Manhattan, depending on where they are, and they're able to get to school, if they get quarantined because of COVID and they test positive, then they might not be then it's like another code, because if they're not present because of the lack of devices for the DOE is providing to us, we have very limited devices that, like, which we've now gotten back some of them, but when, you know, students moved out of the DOE entirely. So that's another issue, is although we've managed that a little bit because we haven't gone like remote or anything, and that's not in the works, it's just, that's another issue, is if they're quarantining or they don't feel comfortable coming to school because they were exposed in school and their child is not vaccinated, that's a whole nother ball game, is the device and the transportation hand in hand, and quarantining.
We have only talked about the families that were transferred out, and I just want to make sure that we also have an opportunity to talk about the families that are still in District 2 and are in temporary housing, and just get an assessment from you about how are they being served, and if and these might be the families that we actually have a better chance to continue supporting. And so what are the policies that we should be advocating as a CC to better serve the families that are still in District 2?
The families that attend District 2 schools are serviced beautifully in all of my schools. I mean, you've got one school here. This school has a room that has everything from blankets to coats to hygiene kits to toothpaste to emergency food. Anybody needs anything, it's there. And there are similar pantries in other District 2 schools. The community coordinator in this school set up weekly Friday food distribution to families. So Friday in the afternoon, they get this big plastic bucket with food that does not need to be refrigerated, and they take it home for the weekend. I mean, I have worked for the DOE for 14 years. I have worked in districts 2, 3, 5, and 6. I'm telling you, I've never seen a district like District 2 with how they take care of their kids. Look at this community board. I mean, I didn't have this in other districts. So and how many times have I reached out to anybody here when I've had a specific need and I didn't know what to do and how do I get something? I've always found you helpful. So I can't think of anything besides the busing, because those needs are being met. Unless now, Stephanie, if you want to change that, feel free.
No, I think that we have been really lucky in that, like, we, you know, that we're in a community where we can reach out, and like, you know, I came from a District 2 school, and I have connections to other partner schools. So even though our school population is not necessarily the same kind of wealth as other District 2 schools, our community is a share the wealth kind of place. And so we take care of each other. And I think that's why it's very upsetting to me that they're taking away the shelters from areas where it's very easy for us to absorb children who need, and it's okay. Everybody gets what they need in our schools. And so I think the pieces that are not getting served are, besides the transportation, is after school programming. At most of our schools, after school is not free. They are fee-based programs that can be very expensive. So if there was some kind of like scholarship or voucher for families who needed that. And then same thing with summer programming. So like Summer Rising wound up sort of happening and it was open to anybody, but I don't know if that's going to be, again, what will happen, but it wasn't camp, and kids deserve a camp experience, and camp in New York City is insanely expensive. And so if there is a way to do some kind of scholarship or funding for camps, those are the two things that I think our
Idea.
kids don't get.
It's a great idea.
Thanks for that, Stephanie. And I see Lilibeth also joined. So she was one of the people I was talking about in terms of the community closet that your school has set up and using it as a model for some of the other schools in the city. So she's been a great partner, as has Fire, who I know is also tuned in. You know, it really takes dedicated parents willing to put forward the effort towards the community. And just underscoring one of the things that you said, Stephanie, in the spring, when we did the whole matching the wish lists and shelters things, there was a phenomenal school in our district, PS 89, that sold out their entire wish list in 10 minutes. So, I mean, the D2 community is massively generous in terms of their time and their wallets. And this is an opportunity to, you know, we've done that. We will continue to do that. I think meetings like this one are giving us a better path forward around our advocacy efforts. I think we can all very much take to heart some of the things Iris was saying about that there is money for doing this. It's just a matter of convincing the people to make better decisions about how to actually spend the money that's allocated for these children. Are there any other questions that we have? Otherwise, I don't want to dominate asking all the questions, but I have at least one other one for Abby. Anybody have a hand that they want to raise or a question they want to ask? All right. So Abby, then when it, you know, some of the things you're talking about are transportation as related to just getting to and from school and after schools. From an academic perspective, is there a learning gap here? Because that's one of the common thoughts that is brought up here. True or false?
So I'm the social worker, so I cannot speak on academics per se, like what's happening in the classroom. But the whole entirety of a student, like their social emotional well-being, in combination with their academics, I would say that it is this transportation issue is definitely, and them not being able to come to school is affected tremendously, dramatically, because, you know, like Iris said, you know, some of these shelters are this like as big as our bathroom, or, you know, big as our bedroom, and that they're just sitting there on their, let's say, a device, or they're watching TV all day long. So I can't speak on academics per se entirely. I know like Miss Lucas might be able to a little bit more, but the social, like this year was a big transition back to school because we've also now had a lot of these students remote or blended learning last year. And so we've really had to use all hands on deck. We have a great crisis team at our school to just support all kids that need support, not just STH kids. I mean, this has been a hard year for all students, academically, social, emotionally, just catching everybody back up to now they're with their peers all day long in a classroom all day long. It's a lot, and they're young.
Can I just toot Abby's horn for a second? Because we couldn't do what we do if we didn't have Abby. So we have kids who, I mean, Abby is helping us create like individualized plans for kids who we're not even worried about their academics right now. We're just worried about their own personal well-being and getting through a school day and feeling good at the end of the day. And so like, there's a lot of academic need out there, but there's also just this much bigger need. And Abby is one of the people who's making sure that our kids are getting all of their needs met. And another reason why it's very upsetting to think that now they're just going to disappear and go someplace else and not have an Abby who's waiting there for them to meet them every morning.
A lot of STH, thank you, that was so kind. A lot of STH school, like community schools, having a Bridging the Gap social worker and community coordinator in one school is very rare. That does not happen in every school, especially that now that all of our students are moving to all the schools outside of District 2. The fact that I was able to even speak with the social worker in the other school that my student may be going to tomorrow, like that they even had a Bridging the Gap social worker. So that's why it's so important that it's not just the physical resources or the clothing and all this, like, you know, the closet that we have to offer. It's this amount of support that we have at PS 51 and the other District 2 schools, PS 111 and such, that other schools outside of the Bronx, they're just so overwhelmed with their STH numbers that, you know, that's the huge blessing comes back into play, because we have a school where we have so much resources at our school, physical, like staff members.
Daniela just asked in the chat a question that I have around the Bridging the Gap social workers, because one of the things Daniela and I have been talking about for the last couple of months is how do we increase the number of you that are out there? But based on, you know, some of what you've said, and Fire, I promise, I saw you had your hand raised and we want to get to you in a second, is it worth advocating for more of them within D2 or just within the DOE in general? I think it's still worth us pushing that agenda, but you know, the threshold is 25. Is that what I'm remembering correctly? 25 STH in a school to
60,
merit
60.
60. Okay.
60.
Okay.
Now, is that a real fact? No, but that's what the criteria was. The Bridging the Gap social workers were paid for by City Hall initially. It's been incorporated into the DOE budget, so it's always going to be there. Abby brings up a salient point, and that is that the families have moved into shelters that are deeply saturated with STH children. I would say Ms. Lucas's numbers are somewhere between, when the numbers were high, somewhere between 50 and 65. And for District 2, that's pretty high. The schools that Abby is talking about, the numbers are 100, 110, 150. So like half the school can be STH. The school could be in between two shelters, and that's what happens. You're adding an additional 50 kids to that. That's a lot. It also starts to feel a little like segregation to me. So yes, we do want to keep them in two. I digress.
Fire, do you still have a question? We'd love to hear from you.
I sure do. I'm a little under the weather, everyone. Please pardon my camera for not being on at this time. I would like to say I commend everyone here for working so hard to make a big difference in our district and in our community to help families and students that are in need. And mainly my comment is that as far as academically, where children are falling behind in their studies, I know that within the shelters that they have their program coordinators, they have the program directors within the shelters that have different groups and resources that are available, where they have different meetings, and that if we can't have those children and students get those resources that they need as far as academically so that they can be caught up, how about we bring it to them so that they can still, you know, within different groups and everything at their shelters, have someone come there and so that they're caught up and they're not the kids that are left behind. So I was just thinking about that, listening to everything that's being said, then that will really help them a lot in the long run. So is it something that possibly that we can do? If they can't get out, let's get it over to them so that they can definitely benefit from it.
Are you saying to provide services in shelters?
Yes,
Is that, I just want to clarify.
Yes, if it's possible.
All right, it's a wonderful idea. There's always money for programming in shelters. What I used to do is hire teachers from the DOE that are familiar with those children, put them in shelters for after school and pay them per session, or bring in a CBO to provide services in the shelter.
Right.
We don't have the shelters anymore. And the other problem we have now is with COVID, Nobody has space. It is not a good idea medically to group all those children because it's like one little room, or maybe it's a little bigger, and you have 15, 20, 25 kids. It becomes a medical issue. So the daycare facilities in the shelters have closed. The after-school programs in the shelters have closed because of COVID and because of not having enough staffing in the shelters to run such a program. It's not just the teacher being there for remediation and tutoring and homework help. It's also other staff members that are going to supervise the kids, provide recreation, have some fun. And many, many shelters. There isn't a shelter in District 2, with the exception of Children's Rescue Fund, that has room for an after-school program.
I completely understand now. So in other words, it makes it a whole lot harder to get them that assistance academically for them to do better. But it was really wrecking my brain. I'm like, what else can we do to help them, you know?
But you bring up a very important point. And with the Title I funds from the school, you can pay a CBO to come in and tutor children where they have lacks, academic lacks. The problem is you're going to do it after school and the kid has no way to get home because there's no bus.
Oh my goodness, I know. Thank you so much, everyone, for everything that you do. I appreciate you all.
Community-based organization.
Thank you.
Yeah. Lilibeth?
I have a question. I'm not sure if it came up, but sorry I was late, everybody. As far as transitioning from when a child is in, let's say, PS51, right? And so now they're graduating 5th grade and they're going to a middle school and they're moving on, right? So they've had a certain support system this whole time and they've been lucky to have it. And then is there any transitional things that happen between the new school, the old school? Is there follow-up, or is it just kind of like these kids are now kind of at the mercy of whatever system they're put in, and they lose an Abby and they lose a PS51 and they lose that community? And how do we bridge that kind of transition that does happen or maybe doesn't happen, but I would foresee that it does. So I think of all the little faces that I've seen since kindergarten with my kids, and now I'm like, oh my gosh, like what's going to happen to all these little ones that aren't so little anymore? So
you want to stay in a District 2 middle school. They're the best schools. You put in your application. It's interesting that you say this because the applications are due today.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
You no longer have the District 2 address. So now you've got the Bronx address. Do you think any middle school in District 2 is going to accept a child living in another borough? I think what you have to say is significant.
I'm just, and I don't know that we as a committee can solve this at all. No. It just breaks my heart to think of that transition for those children. And I'm sure Abby's already felt it. Maybe Stephanie's already felt it as people have transitioned and families have transitioned out and we've lost touch with some. Maybe some do keep in touch. Like, I don't know what kind of support system we offer after the fact, or if we even can and we're allowed to,
It's funny you say that because I see it both ways. All of these children have been in District 2 schools and they've had that experience and it's been wonderful. And if they leave, they're coming away with a positive experience and something that they had not experienced before. In the other shelters I've worked in District 5 and District 6, in applying for high school, because then you've got the specialized schools and you've got all different kinds of high schools. I had such a difficult time working with families to open their eyes to think about maybe you'd like to go to a Millennium, maybe you'd like, because they want to keep the children close. So I think the fact that they've been in District 2 schools with that exposure will make them stronger later on for middle school and high school applications because they have found out there's something good there.
I'm just going to jump in too and we have kids who, not just 5th graders who are matriculating to middle school, but we have kids who move for various reasons.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny that you said, like, what's our system and are we allowed to? And that is an interesting glitch because you're not really supposed to reach out unless you get permission from the parent to connect to the school. So like we have our own little system where we ask the parents, is it okay if we call the new school and just say that, what Abby was working on with them and what's going on? And most parents say yes and are thankful, but some parents say no, it's a fresh start. We want let them do what they got to do to get to know my kid. But we do call schools all the time and just say, like, how's it going? Iris won't want to hear this, but there's a little boy who left a couple of years ago who we think about all the time. And we checked in just to ask how he's doing now.
I
And
just asked about him. Sincere you're talking about, right?
uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they are our kids, even if they're only with us for a couple of months.
Yeah.
We make sure that they land softly wherever they do land.
And so I think
Okay.
that kind of ties back really back to like the support that we have here is because like it's different this year. Every year has been different. I've only been in the DOE for, this is my 3rd school year, but every year has been different because we've had a whole pandemic that has totally transformed learning for all these kids. And so I think the beauty of being in person, fully in person with all of our kids this year is that we can get back to all those graduation things that we used to do, of just like keeping that, like bridging that gap essentially of when they go on and filling that community, because these kids, whether they're STH or permanently housed students, go everywhere. Like, of course, like majority like Morton and all these like big schools that are in District 2, but if they've moved, even just their family moved to Brooklyn or Queens, or it's just more ideal based on their whatever the circumstances, these kids like have now grown up, like you said, for 5 years, 6 years with the same kids and now are going to a new school. So even though like as teachers, we can't like I can't be like, hey, bridging the gap social worker at Morton, if there is one, but you know what I mean? Like then there's still other ways to make sure that the kids feel that community. And of course, if there's concerns, the parents can then give that little permission thing.
Right.
But I think that's the beauty of also, that's why we're trying to pull the kids, keep the kids at PS51 as well, because now we're finally seeing them in person every day. It's not as easy. During the pandemic, we had so many kids, we had a lot of kids moving around, getting permanent housing, like, but we were able to be remote. So now we've also faced this issue coming back of, they moved during 2020 to the Bronx and it was never an issue until this year, because now they have to report back in person and their attendance
It's plummeting. Yeah.
because they can't get a bus.
Yeah.
Well, you all make me want to go to PS51. So well done on creating such a wonderful and warm and supportive environment for your family. Daniela, it looked like you were about to say something.
Yeah, can I just ask one last, well, I want to make a comment and then one last question for Iris. A lot of what we have talked here is just like trying to keep these families in D2 because we have such great schools. It just makes me think, we need great schools everywhere. Like the problem is actually, it's like, it cannot just be the solution just to keep them here because, and I know it's like, of course, that's more realistic and you're dealing with real children, real families in front of you, right? But I think from a policy perspective, apologies, my dog is trying to enter the office. It is, we need to have the schools great with all the systems and supports that, that Ms. Lucas is able to offer to her families everywhere. I think that's, for me, that's the biggest takeaway. But the other thing that I want to ask is specifically for D2, you mentioned that there is one shelter that, they close the daycare, they close all of this because of COVID. And I am so frustrated of how people are approaching COVID. Now, apparently, like our only goal is like protect children from COVID, but we don't think about all the other costs associated with all these decisions that we're making. So is there any plan to reopen the daycare facility? Is there any plan to reopen after school activities in this shelter that is here in D2? And if there is no plan, is there anything that we can do around that, advocating for that? So at least the families who are here in D2 are able to have some level of support, after school where they are living?
I would hope so. Right now, the shelters have gotten decimated. I would say half the staff are out with COVID. Everybody has COVID. So developing anything right now, I've got in another district, there is a family assistant that sits in the shelter alone. All the case managers are out. They're all sick. As this wave passes, maybe into the spring when things get better, I don't see why it wouldn't be feasible if they have the space. And that's the operative term, to have the space. You need to have a decent room with supplies and a bathroom. And in the private vendors in some of the shelters, they want to use every inch of space to stick another family in. The more family, the more revenue. So not all the shelters have that kind of space. Some do, but I would hope so. I think it's great because they're right there. And if we can't get busing, we'll send the teachers to the shelter. The other thing we can do for kids in the spring is maybe have Saturday academies. God help me for saying this. Maybe you don't want to do this. Open the school on Saturdays. Have the kids come in. Do a half a day of academics and a half a day of fun. It's just an idea.
All right, any last questions while we have our special guests here? And thank you all. This has been very informative to give us a real look at the issues that you're grappling with. If not, thank you so much. We no doubt will be back in touch with you, Iris, Abby, Ms. Lucas. Thank you again for all of your efforts, and we're here to support you. So if you also would like for us to advocate on anything on your behalf, there's at least 4 of us from CECD2 who are in this meeting and who talk about this frequently. This is one of the centerpiece things that our CEC has been working on. By hook or by crook, we will make sure that it remains a centerpiece. So please feel free to reach out to us if you think that we can be of assistance, but we'll probably put our heads together and see what we can do on our end as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was
All right, everyone. Thanks and good night.
Good night. Good
And
night.
thanks to everybody who came and listened as well. Your advocacy helps.
Thank you.
There are a lot of people listening also on live stream. I got
Yeah.
messages.
Thanks, everybody. All right. Good night.